Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is our 5th DHEP, Deaf Hub Exploring Perspectives, so far this year. We do have a QR code that's posted on the door there if you'd like to access live captions, so please feel free to take advantage of that. If you have any questions during the presentation, that's fine. You can raise your hand. Give me just a moment to come up on stage and I'll be able to copy sign your questions. Okay? Today we are welcoming Dr. Aileen Aldalur. She is a certified clinical psychologist working at the University of Rochester Medical Center in the Deaf Wellness Center. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So today I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about my journey to becoming a clinical psychologist and what that looked like. I will also talk about some of the challenges that I faced along the way, and as Dylan said, feel free to ask me any questions as I'm talking. I like that. I like the engagement because I would much rather you ask me questions so I know what you're learning from this presentation. This is just who I am. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I work at the Deaf Wellness Center, which is under the Strong Memorial Hospital at the University of Rochester. Most of the time I do therapy, working with deaf clients, both with individual therapy as well as couples counseling, but truly that's only 15% of my time. The other 85% of my time is doing clinical research on issues within the deaf community. These are the topics that I'm going to be speaking on today. And really, in terms of my personal identity, that development led me to where I am now. I'm going to talk to you about my family background, how I found out I was deaf, my language journey, because a lot of that has had an impact on how my career journey changed. I am born in Southern California. It's a beautiful, sunny Southern California. I miss my home state. My family is both Spanish and Cuban. My mother is from Cuba. My father is originally from Spain. And they moved to the United States prior to all of their children being born. When I was born, they assumed that I was hearing. I was born in the 90s, and during that time, screenings should have been pretty standard at birth to test for hearing ability. I did learn Spanish first. We spoke Spanish in the home, and when I went into public school, I got bullied for having a bit of an accent when I spoke English, right? And so I did use some of my Spanish because we were a Spanish household. My grandmother spoke primarily Spanish, so I did use Spanish with her, but I then at some point dropped the Spanish and just started speaking English. At the age of 7, I believe, which was 2nd grade for me, I was in a regular public school, and it was standard at the time for them to perform a hearing test. And I didn't know at the time that there was anything different about my hearing. So I went to the nurse, got my hearing test, and then they referred me on to an audiologist. And so my mother, along with my mother's mother, my grandmother, attended this audiologist, and we all got a hearing test. I was 7, my mother was in her 40s, my grandmother was in her 60s. All of us had some sort of hearing loss. All of us left that appointment getting hearing aids. And so with my hearing aids, I could function like a hearing person relatively well. I did not have any accommodations going through school. I didn't know what an IEP was. At the time, no one instructed my family as to what accommodations or things were offered. They just gave me hearing aids and sent me on my way. I actually never met another deaf person. I never saw another individual who had hearing aids other than family. I knew nothing about the community or the culture. So really, the entire time that I was going through school, I was having a progressive hearing loss, but I stayed in a public school setting. Now, my parents were told that with the hearing aids, my hearing would just sustain itself. that was not the case, and I had to keep getting my hearing aid adjusted. I didn't know, again, anything about IEPs. I didn't know anything about sign language or any sort of accommodations. And again, remember, my parents were immigrants. So they did not know the ins and outs of the American school system. They did not know how to advocate for their children to get the necessary accommodations that were needed in schools. And so I just made it work. And so again, by the time I reached high school, I was no longer able to function with my hearing aids the way I had. My hearing had declined to that point, where I needed to get additional reading materials on my own to be able to keep up with what was happening in class. And there were a number of different books I know that people talk about, like the self-help books of how you overcome adversity, right? And I was having adversity at the time, and I really enjoyed those books, and I really got into the psychology of that. And so at the end of high school, I knew that psychology was the field I wanted to study. Now, at that point, I still did not have any sort of sign language, but I decided that I wanted to go into the field of psychology. I went to the California State University of Long Beach, and looking back now, I don't remember, but I believe my thought process was like, well, you know, I'm going to be a psychologist, and if I'm going to be doing therapy one-on-one, what's going to happen? Because I'm going to need to hear that person, and I can't hear. And again, remember, I did not have any experience with getting any sort of accommodation. So I had talked myself out of that and was like, that's not going to be possible. So I thought nursing. For some reason, I thought maybe that would be an easier profession for somebody who couldn't hear so well. But for all of the women that were in my family, all of them worked in healthcare in some way, shape, or form. And so I thought I would follow suit. So I started taking science classes and started working at one of the local hospitals where my sister-in-law was to pursue a nursing degree. And then I started dating. And this guy didn't know any sign language. He was hearing, but at the time, I was going back to the audiologist because my hearing had declined so badly that I was having difficulty functioning. And so I sat down with this boyfriend of mine and I said, you know, maybe we shouldn't be together. I can't hear you. I don't want to burden you. And he's like, what are you talking about? Let's sign, right? And I'm like, that's like somebody saying to me, well, just learn Chinese, right? Because I didn't know that sign language was a language that could be associated with people who couldn't hear. And he's like, it'll be fun. We can take it together. And I'm like, well, I like you, so sure, I'll do anything you want to do. So we signed up for this ASL class, and that was the moment my life changed. I learned about deaf community. I learned about culture. I mean, in Southern California, you know, Northridge and Riverside and all of that, at that moment, I changed my major and I was like, I have to go to a deaf university. This is where I have to be. I have to do something with this. I don't know what I'm going to major in. I need to be with deaf people. So I was on the fence about whether I was going to apply for CSUN or to Gallaudet. So I applied to both. And Gallaudet gave me a scholarship, and my father said, well, that decision's made. So I went to Gallaudet. I moved across the whole country. And before I transferred, I had taken up to ASL 4. I had been associating with deaf people, and I thought I knew my way around sign language. And I arrived on Gallaudet campus and found out how wrong I was. My first day, the professor came in and signed and was very clear, and I feel like I caught 60% of what was said. And I thought, okay, and they're like, all right, we're gonna go around the room, please introduce yourselves. And I'm sitting there thinking, I got this. And I caught nothing of what anybody else said. I'd never seen signed exact English before. I'd never seen pidgin signed English before. I'd never seen true ASL before. I was lost and immediately overwhelmed. I also was homesick, and I missed my boyfriend, I missed my family, and at that moment, really was in a place where I'm like, oh my God, maybe I hate deaf people. I was so overwhelmed, you know, because in Gallaudet, I lived in the dorms on the 6th floor, and when you go into the elevator, generally, you talk to people in the elevator ride on the way up, right? And so I would just avoid the elevator. I lost 15 pounds my first year because I was just taking stairs because I could not bring myself to interact with people. But I was a part of an honors program, and there were 2 other students that had similar backgrounds, one of which who was also Latina. And I really resonated with them, and I believe that because of them, I now like deaf culture and I like deaf people. They sort of brought me into the fold from being in a true panic state. So when I got into Gallaudet, I chose to go back to psychology again, right? Because I'm like, if I can sign, then that means I can actually talk with people and I can listen to people, right? I can also have interpreters. It was my first time learning about having interpreters. And so I thought, why not go back to my first love? So this top picture, those are my 2 best friends. And maybe now, I don't know if some of you saw Queer Eye. Does anybody watch that show? Yeah? So the woman that's in that picture, right, Kylie Delato, was actually just on the Queer Eye show. She is now the Louisiana School for the Deaf superintendent. So I knew her before she was cool. Please know. But no, she's a really good friend of mine. And some of my personal experiences just in terms of the culture shock that I experienced at Galley, I believe really has had an impact on the kind of research that I do. When you do a PhD, you have to do a capstone of some form. And my advisor said, well, why don't you get yourself into research? And initially I thought body image and eating disorders. Because again, when you're talking other cultures, Black culture, Latina culture, that is something that we can see across cultures. Body image, how one relates to one's body culturally. And so I'm like, well, why not look at that with deaf culture and see if that has an impact? And one of the big cultural factors is the stress that people of that culture feel, right? Especially if they are on the cusp between 2 cultures, their own and if they're American culture. And I thought, well, I resonate with that. I grew up in a Spanish household. We had Spanish culture and then also American culture, and how sometimes those cultures are in direct odds. And the stress that you feel about which one do you conform to. And so I developed the idea of a culture of stress as one of my research interests. And so I'm sure now you're looking at me at this stage and going, wow, you know, you've really come a long way. But I couldn't even handle a full-time class schedule when I started this journey, right? I only took 4 classes initially. It took me 5 years to graduate from my undergrad because I didn't want to have a full-time schedule. And then when I had to work, I had to figure out how to manage working on top of my course schedule. And when I was an undergrad, I knew that I wanted to go on to grad school, but I didn't want to think about it until after I graduated with my undergrad. And then I took a year off. I wanted to work in the community. I worked full-time. I studied for my GREs. And then I started the process of applying to different PhD programs. I initially wanted to stay in California. That's where my family was. That's where I was originally from. And so that was the goal. But I don't know if you all know about how getting a PhD works. Traditionally, you need to match with a certain faculty member whose research interests align with yours. And so you need to reach out and network with these faculty members prior to applying to see whether or not you're a good fit. And then you apply. And so I'm thinking, I studied deaf acculturative stress. Traditional clinical psychology programs don't have anyone who studies deaf acculturative stress. So reaching out to those universities in California is probably not going to be optional, or going to be an option. I did anyway, but I also applied to Gallaudet University. I was only accepted at Gallaudet. And truly, it was the best fit for me in terms of my research interests. So I moved back to DC. Now, when you first go into a clinical psychology PhD program, your first year is coursework. It is theory, it is foundational information, making sure that you are familiar with research methods that have been done in the literature that's already out there. They also do expect you to have a research idea in advance. I was very fortunate because I had done that, and I'd also developed a measure for the acculturative stress. You also take some intro to psych classes, some other additional gender psychology courses as well. In my second year, I was doing mental health service work with Gallaudet University students, as well as going off campus for a number of different rotations. I worked with those with severe mental health, schizophrenia, and bipolar. I also worked at the Riverside School for the Deaf. I worked in a trauma center. I did a number of different rotations so that I got a good feel of what is out there in the field. So in terms of training opportunities, right, generally PhDs in clinical psychology, they have a very structured training program. You need to learn trauma-informed care and what severe trauma and treatment looks like for those individuals. If you have individuals with schizophrenia and severe trauma, then there are treatments for those. There are none that are geared for the deaf community, right? We have only programs and treatments that are for hearing individuals that have been modified using an interpreter, okay? But I'm like, I was going to do my clinical work, right? My initial goal was to create my own practice. So at the second year in my program at Gallaudet's mental health clinic, I had one hearing person come in for an assessment. And I thought, okay, that's fine, we can do this. And they sat down, and in order to schedule their session, I had to schedule them 2 weeks in advance so that I could hopefully procure an interpreter, right? The assessment was all day. They would come to our facility, and we would do a number of different tasks for this assessment, right? So I agreed the date and time with that patient because they had to take off work. And then I could not find an interpreter. I could not get an interpreter. And I felt like this poor individual, right, was having to take off work, perhaps not get paid for the time that they took off, because their psychologist couldn't seem to manage getting their own communication resources in line, right? And again, I had no experience working with interpreters growing up. I had no accommodations of any kind, really, growing up. And while I was at Gallaudet, I didn't need interpreters, right? I never had to fight that battle for language access until this point. And I was furious. And at that point, I thought, all right, well, that's it. I won't see hearing clients because I'm not going to put anybody through this, right? But in order to go through this structured training program, that was going to need to happen. So then I had to develop my own track and took a lot on in order to just avoid seeing hearing patients. Now, that also meant that I got a very customized training experience, and it was very cool, and I learned a lot. But I did not have evidence-based treatments and evidence-based practices that I was following along like everyone else in a clinical psychology program. One of the other challenges that I faced was generally, again, when you apply, I sent some applications to other universities or other institutions. And you have to write a cover letter of why you should be the one they choose. And I struggled with whether or not I should say that I was deaf or not. As a deaf person, we know we get discriminated against a lot. And again, being at Gallaudet is a deaf space. And so I was there for my undergrad, and I thought, oh, okay, this is going to be the same in my PhD world. And it wasn't, right? Most of the students that were in my PhD were hearing, right? The class environments were generally taught using simultaneous communication of both spoken English and sign language. And so when it was time for me to apply to things off campus, I didn't know what to do. No one had shown me how to navigate this, and so I'm like, okay, I don't want anyone to know that I'm deaf. So I kept that piece of information out of the cover letter. And when I was then brought on for an interview, I had to ask for interpreting services. And then that caused problems. And so during the interview, I was then tasked with trying to make them feel better about me needing accommodations and services, right? Another big challenge that I faced was, again, as I was avoiding working with hearing clients, that became problematic because in your last year, you have to match at an institution for an internship. The American Psychology Association has to have accredited those institutions. So I'm like, all right, so are there any deaf APA accredited sites? There was one, the University of Rochester at the Deaf Wellness Center. But I'm like, okay, I can't guarantee that I'm going to match with them, so I have to apply out broadly, and I've never worked with hearing clients. So my last year, I thought, okay, I really need to buckle down and start training on working with hearing clients. And again, because I had been in California, there was a large hospital institution that had a small deaf program that was there as well as hearing clients. So I thought, okay, I can do that. It was a 72-hour training course because it was a sexual violence and domestic violence geared training. So I had to take all the required trainings. I did that, got into their program. And on the first day, what I noticed was many of the managers, and again, my name sign is signed Aileen, right? It's AA across. As they were going through the training, these managers were saying, well, this won't apply to you, Aileen. This won't apply to you. And you're going to be doing the deaf clients. So this piece here isn't going to apply. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I guess I don't understand why a lot of these things aren't going to apply to the deaf program. So eventually I sent an email to leadership and said, I think that this needs to be addressed. And I point blank said, I think you don't believe that I am capable of working with hearing clients. And I believe that this is how you are showing that lack of confidence in me. And they, fell back on the customary refrain of, well, we don't know about interpreters and we don't know how this is all going to work. And I'm like, we're using an interpreter right now for this meeting. This is how this works. But it's like, yes, deaf psychologists can meet with hearing clients. So I convinced them to give me a trial basis. And they gave me 1 or 2 hearing clients, and if things went well, they would increase that number over time. But it sounds terrible to think that a program that had a deaf program underneath their umbrella did not believe that deaf people could do this job, but they did. That was just an underlying bias. And so we then had to repair that relationship. Thankfully, my manager admitted to that bias, and we could repair that. And so as I said, when you match for your internship, you are gone then for the entire year. So I sent to 13 different locations, and I received 8 calls for interview. The cool thing about that is, as I was in my clinical training, I had not announced to any of these locations that I was deaf. And so I had other friends who were going through the same experience, a couple who were a few years ahead of me. And so one, she didn't match the first time she sent out her applications for internship, but she matched the second time. And so she came back to Gallaudet and shared her experience of being a deaf person trying to navigate the system. And she said, so the first time I didn't announce that I was deaf, and I applied for internships, and things did not go well. And the second time I did my second round, I did, because I thought, why not fight the fight to begin with? And so I took that advice and learned how to schedule interpreters. And so in all of my letters that I sent out for internship, I announced that I was deaf. I announced how I needed accommodations to be made. And I got 8 interviews. And then when I arrived at the interviews, I also got inappropriate questions. because I would get there, and I generally do speak for myself pretty regularly. So these interviews, I was using spoken English. And you get the customary questions from hearing people of, can you lip read? Can you understand me? And you'd have to do the uncomfortable of, well, obviously not. This is why I asked for an interpreter. However, in regular practice, these interviews center around your therapeutic process or how you would handle certain cases. But in my situation, I would get the questions of, well, so how are patients going to work with interpreters? Or if we bring you on, how are we going to, who is paying for the interpreters? And those were the kinds of questions that I was often being asked. No one really talked about my therapeutic process, which I feel like was high priority, but apparently they didn't. And so in order to integrate into the system, you have to be able to match, and they have to be willing to take you on. So I matched at the Deaf Wellness Center in the University of Rochester. But I would say most of the time throughout my internship, I was working with hearing clients. I did have a small percentage of deaf patients that I also worked with. I then finished my internship and graduated. When you graduate from a clinical psychology program, you do become a doctor, right? You now have your PhD, but you do not have your license yet. Again, I had minimal experience with working with interpreters. And prior to my internship, I got in as much experience with working with hearing patients as I could. I also then had to deal with scheduling interpreters. I didn't have regular interpreters until I arrived here. And the University of Rochester Medical Center have a pool of interpreters that work with the deaf professionals that work there. And when I came on board, I met with their coordinator and they said, okay, so what interpreter would you like to have? And I'm like, I don't know. No one's ever asked me that question before. And they said, okay, well, we have a number of interpreters for you to choose from. Take a look at some of them, see if you like what you see. And at that time, I didn't really have a schedule for all day need, right? I had a lot of downtime. And they said, that's okay, just pick a team. Maybe try to find 2 or 3 interpreters at the time. And the interpreter that I'm working with today, who is voicing for me, is one of the interpreters that I chose back then. So she's been with me a long time. So I went through the process of actually being able to choose an interpreter that works best for me, and that makes all the difference. When you're a professional and you are trying to just function at the level that other PhDs function at, you are dealing with a very specialized set of vocabulary, you're dealing with a very specialized set of expectations, right? When I'm going to do large presentations, which are expected at my career level, if I'm doing those in American Sign Language, the audience, if they do not sign, is going to associate me with the voice that's coming from the interpreter, with the microphone, right? And so being able to have an interpreter who can learn me and learn how I want to be presented to a hearing audience, as well as the vocabulary that I use, the field that I am in, that made a huge difference. And how I learned it was a big difference was thanks to COVID. When COVID hit, there were budget cuts. And the interpreters that I had chosen to be my designated interpreters, my designated team of 3, were then laid off. My hearing patients, I had a number of hearing patients who had said, I don't want to have a revolving door of interpreters. I want to have the same interpreter with you. So when those budget cuts happened, my work was impacted. I was then getting whatever staff interpreter the hospital could provide, and it was a mess. And again, when I first went into my PhD program, I was going to have my own practice. I was going to be a clinical psychologist. And so then I did clinical work, and I liked it, but then I realized I didn't want to do it full time. My personality is very much introverted. I like dealing with the least number of people as I possibly can, right? But I like writing. I like statistics. I like research. That's my jam. However, because there are no evidence-based treatments in current use that are adapted for the deaf community, it's really difficult to be able to use what is tried and true for hearing populations and know that it's going to work for deaf populations. And we have seen that for years. And so on my internship, I decided that I wanted to follow a research career instead of a clinical career. And as I mentioned, when you graduate from a clinical program, you are become a doctor, but you are not licensed. You then have to go on to your postdoctorate, and those get you whatever hours you need in order to satisfy a licensure requirement, all right? And I knew that I didn't want to do clinical work. The other members of my cohort who were hearing, who came in at the same time that I did want to pursue clinical work. So I thought about the RPP, it's the Rochester Postdoc Partnership that the University of Rochester has. I thought that might also be an option for me. But yes, this basically talks about why I wanted my research career. And again, it wasn't just the fact that we didn't have treatment available that was suitable for deaf people. We don't have data about how deaf people function in the world in relation to anybody else that's being studied. We have these giant national studies that put out surveys every year, and there's no question about hearing status or cultural identity in terms of deafness. Nothing. Our census information cannot even be accessed and filtered down to how many deaf people we have in the United States. So there are just huge gaps that I thought it would be so interesting to be able to fill. That's not to say that we don't know anything. We do know some things. We do know that because there has been some deaf research done, I would say within the last 10 years, surveys have been sent out in American Sign Language. We see that all of these specific issues tend to be higher within the deaf community than they are within the hearing communities. We also see these being other risk factors that are generally associated within the deaf population, right? If you have trauma in your childhood and you are deaf, generally that trauma is going to be duplicated, right? This is why we have a generally higher mental health issues, is because society and the systems that we are living in and under are not geared to serve us. Not often do people in general go to treatment, be it for mental health issues, be it for substance abuse issues, but the research has shown that 44% of hearing populations go to treatment. In deaf populations, we see it less. It's now 31% in the deaf population. Only 6% of the deaf population will go for substance abuse, but that 31% goes for mental health treatment. And again, the barriers to treatment are many. Often our population doesn't know what treatments are available or what treatment looks like. If they even can get a deaf psychologist or a psychologist who signs fluently, there's always the stigma of treatment. There's always the experience of oppression that we have had in just being in hearing spaces that we assume is going to be the same in a therapeutic space. In terms of the stigma, a lot of deaf folks are really concerned that if they go to treatment, then everybody immediately is going to know. And that's going to ruin one's reputation, and that they're going to be seen in a very different light in the community than they would be if they did not go to treatment. Returning to my postdoc experience, I decided that I wanted to pursue research, but I didn't know how to go about it. And I feel very fortunate because as I was going through my internship, out of nowhere, a hearing faculty member from the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Rochester reached out to me. And he had received a grant to study people who were not enlisted in treatment yet, but were thinking about seeking treatment for either substance abuse or mental health, and seeing what factors would convince them to get treatment or not. And again, this was within the hearing population. And they were running this trial out of Rochester. And several deaf people had seen a flyer for his trial and contacted him, and he didn't know any sign language, he didn't know anything about deaf people, and so he started asking around. And as he asked around, my name came up. And so he reached out to me directly and said, so I might have a postdoc opportunity. We can get a disability grant and see if you would like to pursue this, if you would, because I don't know anything about this population. And so I said, okay. And so once I graduate, we applied for that, and I got the disability grant, or diversity grant, excuse me. And I was able to study how clinical treatment works within the deaf population. And so I took his treatment seeking, cognitive behavioral therapy for treatment seeking in a hearing population, and adapted that to the deaf population. What different beliefs we held, what different values we had. And so at the end of that, I now have an adapted measure for that. I also passed my licensure exam and was then fully licensed to work as a clinical psychologist. So during my postdoc, I learned how to write a grant. You had to write your specific methods section and research aims. If you are going to do research, you have to be able to sustain yourself somehow, and that comes from getting grants, either from the National Science Foundation or from the National Institute of Health or from other mechanisms. But so I wrote my grant, and which is what I'm under right now, and I have another one out that I will hopefully receive. But so the intervention that I adapted wrote my second grant to see whether or not that adaptation actually was successful. The first grant was to see whether or not the adaptation was going to work at all, and I'm here to tell you it does. But I also, in the meantime, became faculty. So once I received my licensure, I was able to then get promoted to a faculty member at the University of Rochester. 85% of my effort is spent on research, and again, 15% of my effort is working within the clinical sphere. I spend my time doing a number of different things. I don't have a regular 9-to-5 job where I go to my office every day and I sit and I work with patients, right? I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to feel like I had to show up at my office. So occasionally I work from home, right? Occasionally I do a similar presentation with medical students at the hospital. I come to see you all. I wear a number of different hats within my job sphere. Now, with the good, also comes the bad. We'll start with the good. I have flexibility like you wouldn't believe. I can get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and start work if I want to. I can also get up at 10 o'clock in the morning and start work if I want to, right? I determine when I go to my office. I determine what days I have off. I determine whether or not I am able to accommodate anybody else's schedule. Right? I get to go to work in my pajamas sometimes if I am working remotely from home. I can also work anywhere, right? And often I'm alone. And so that's really nice because then I am only working off of my own process. I just actually had my first research assistant who actually came from RIT. He was in his undergrad while he was working with me, and so I got the opportunity to supervise him and feel like I had some experience within that supervisory role. I'm able to learn lots of new things. I remember being an undergrad and people asking me what I wanted to be, and I said, if I could get paid to be a constant student, I would. And I feel like I have manifested that for myself. I feel like with my job now, I am constantly learning. I am still able to take courses if I want. With some of the grants that I'm writing, I can factor that into the grant itself. Now, I don't need to pass that class necessarily. I'm not really concerned about my grades in that class, but I'm taking it just for my own edification. Now, the other cool thing is that I get to travel for work. I get to go to different research conferences. I get to go to Hawaii and California. And so I feel like I've become a traveler thanks to my conference opportunities. Now, in terms of the bad, very little stability in terms of getting grants, in terms of what I'm doing every day. Now, I don't have a family. I don't have children. And if I did, then it may be that I would want to change some of these aspects to be able to provide some more stability. But right now, in order to work, and then if I pause work for any reason, it's sometimes difficult to get back into the swing of things, right? Also being concerned just about failure in general, right? Sometimes you get rejections back that are pretty harsh, and they can do a real number on your own self-esteem. And especially on research that you've worked so hard on. So that's part of it. And it also can be isolating, right? If I'm not going to the office and I'm not seeing other colleagues for a long period of time, you do start to get down. And so I have to remind myself to get back out into the rest of the world. So this is just sort of a 30,000-foot view of the kinds of research that I'm involved in right now. I don't always have several different projects going at the same time, but currently, because I do, it's very nice. We're in different stages for each one of these. One, I'm collecting data. Another, I am doing data analysis on. But for that top one, that's my clinical trial. That's the one that has just gotten completed. The Deaf Wellness Center is doing a needs assessment to identify what our community needs from us as a mental health service provider. And then currently, I am involved in a clinical treatment trial for eye movement. The Deaf Wellness Center providers have taken a training on that, and now we are trying to sort of test whether or not that's something that is suitable for the population that we serve. I also am involved in translation of measures, different diagnostic measures that are not currently available in American Sign Language. If we get a patient in who doesn't understand written English, we then on the fly have to translate those measures, which is not standardized practice. We like to know that we have good, reliable measures. So that's also something I'm involved in. All right, and then this is my dog.
Any questions from anyone? We're open to questions from the audience. Yeah. Someone's brave enough to ask the first question. Go ahead. I'm wondering about the licensing process. How long did it take for you to get your license?
So, every state is different. I will say that they do have different requirements that you have to satisfy. For the state of New York, once you graduate, you have approximately a full year to get some additional supervision hours. Now, the cool thing about New York State is those additional supervision hours don't have to be directly within clinical care. So those can be teaching. It can also be doing research. So there is some flexibility there. I tracked my hours within that full year, getting clinical supervision. But within that year, I also studied. And I will tell you that your licensure exam is brutal. I actually studied longer than I really needed to. But if you score at a certain level, you need to get a certain level above the required score. You don't have to be leaps and bounds above it. You just have to meet that score of passing. But it does take roughly about a year's worth of time.
Can you explain a little bit more about why it's important to have graduate school or additional training for practicing psychologists?
Well, So you need to have, at minimum, a master's degree for any sort of clinical work. You really can't do clinical work with just a bachelor's degree. So that's one of the primary reasons. And then to be a clinical psychologist, you need to have a PhD. Your master's degree can get you to social work or to a counselor's level, but you cannot become a clinical psychologist without getting a PhD. The reason it's important is because there's just a lot of skill-based things you need to learn. When you are sitting with someone and engaging with someone in a therapeutic space, there are things that we would think are common sense that aren't, right? You also need to spend a lot of time working on yourself in that, so that you can be able to provide treatment and evidence-based treatment. It's not like somebody's going to come and sit and talk about just the bad day. We're there to really treat some significant things for these folks. And so that has the additional benefit. If you want to do clinical work and just sit with people, then your master's is sufficient, and that's great. You would not need to pursue a PhD. A PhD, however, will open a lot of doors for a lot of different opportunities. Again, I don't do now what I originally thought I was going to do when I started this journey. I do a lot of other things that would not be available to me if I only had a master's. So doing clinical research would not be possible if I just had a master's. I would be required to get a PhD for that. So I can do administrative stuff. I can supervise other clinics, right? With a master's degree, I would not be able to do that. So I guess it really depends on what you want.
Hi, wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. You mentioned some of the statistics that the prevalence rates in the deaf community being higher than the hearing community. How do we fix those gaps in resources, in the systematic barriers that deaf individuals face? In your professional opinion, what are the steps that we need to do to solve those issues?
I mean, some to me are things that we already know, right? One is we need more deaf therapists. We need more deaf counselors. We need more deaf providers and practitioners out there. Deaf people want to see other deaf people, or at least people who are fluent in American Sign Language. And we also need other options, because another issue that we have is if you want a deaf counselor, you also want a deaf counselor who maybe doesn't know you. No one wants to go see their best friend for therapy or their best friend's neighbor for therapy. Often that therapeutic space is, you want to be private, and you want to guarantee you can assure that privacy. So if we had more therapists, our population would feel like they have more options. If you're living in Kansas and you have two options, you know, that's more likely that you're going to opt to not go to treatment instead. So numbers is one thing. And two, I think that insurance is another issue, right? Lots of public insurance won't be taken by private practices. And for both hearing as well as for deaf patients, even if there were no barriers, right? Even if you are financially set and you have good insurance, there are still other things that make folks not go to treatment, right? Be it the stigma, be it the concern of confidentiality, right? What needs to happen before you go into therapy and how one sits with you. And we need to have education on what therapy looks like, different options for therapy, to really be able to encourage folks to go. I mean, and again, it's not just deaf people. Hearing people we often see too. They don't know what their options for therapy are. And so it's helpful to have someone help navigate through that system. So I think that would be really nice if we could sort of create a warm handoff space of sitting with folks and saying, okay, so if you're considering therapy, here's the different kind of therapies that are out there, and here's how you navigate that space. That would be great.
I have a question about school and then also your current career. So I'm wondering, the articles that you've written, these articles, or the articles that you've written, how did you manage your time writing articles at the same time that you're doing everything else?
Yeah, so I'm still writing a lot of different manuscripts. I think that's probably one of the largest goals I have for my career. And as a researcher, you will likely hear other researchers say it's publish or perish. So you are either doing research and publishing it, or you're not doing research anymore. But yeah, so writing is something that I do all of the time. And in terms of how I manage it, it's a great question. I have no deadlines, really. So it's not like I have an article that's due tomorrow and I'm pressed for time. I write an article whenever I want to write an article. Now, there are some other deadlines, right? In terms of writing my notes or progress notes when I'm working with patients, those have deadlines. And so those types of things do take me away from the writing. But what I have done is whatever time I wake up in the morning, I have scheduled my day to at least have an hour where I am focusing on writing, right? And if it's that day, and I don't feel well that day, it can be my references page. But I do some form of writing every morning. And if I get into a rhythm and I keep going, great. And if I don't, then I stop after an hour. But I will say sometimes it is easier to get the writing done when I have a deadline, because then it's something that's looming over.
I'm wondering, right now I'm studying criminal justice, and for a clinical psychologist, I'm wondering about forensic psychology and how that works with the criminal justice system and how those interact. Do you have any experience with that? With situations that happen criminally and evidence is brought to court through the criminal justice system. Do you have any experience with that type of thing in forensic psychology?
So again, clinical psychology is a very broad field, right? But how I like to look at it is you are working with clients and patients within a clinical sphere, right? Now, in clinical psychology, there are a number of different specialities that you can do. So when I was in grad school, I told you I did a number of different rotations to see what all was out there that was under the umbrella of clinical psychology. We have neuropsychology, you have forensic psychology, you have pediatric psychology, which is very different than working with adults, trauma-based psychologies. There are some that do require additional certifications. So I know that within neuropsychology, if you are seeing people with specific neuro deficits, right, Alzheimer's and that, there are additional trainings and additional certifications that you have to get in order to call yourself a neuropsychologist. Now, I have given some of these neuro measures in the past, but I in no way, shape, or form can call myself a neuropsychologist. You have to have a certain level of experience. Like if I was to apply for a job as a neuropsychologist now, I think I would probably be laughed out of the room. I would need to make sure that I'm getting the required trainings first in order to do that. Now, again, I primarily work with deaf individuals and within trauma. And we see a number of different things, but I do also think it depends on where you work.
Okay, we just have about 3 minutes left, so we'll go ahead and wrap up at this point. There were just a couple things I wanted to mention as we wrap up. First thing is that it's important to get a master's or a PhD because then people can't ignore you. You have evidence about what you can do and what difference you can make in the world. There are not enough deaf and hard of hearing people represented. There aren't enough deaf and hard of hearing role models. But look around and recognize that all of us sitting next to each other in this room are our future role models for each other. We can expose other deaf people to what we can do as deaf and hard of hearing people. And at the same time, as we talk with each other, we realize what we can do based on what other people do too. We can do both. And if we work only in deaf space, in the ivory tower, that's something that we can make that choice to do, but we can also make the choice to go out into the hearing world and make a difference for the rest of us. And then interpreters. For those of us who use interpreters, we can still speak English. Many people think we can't. But the fact is that they can't speak sign language is really how we need to frame that. So I want to suggest that you all contact me, djldhb@rit.edu, if you have anything to share about this presentation. And you're also welcome to come sit with me or with other members of my team to talk more about navigating graduate school or the real world. So I hope you all enjoyed the presentation today. And our next DHEP is on April 5th in the Ingle Auditorium with Dr. Sarah Blick-Nitko. So I hope to see you all there again. Okay? Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thank you so, so much, Dr. Aldalur.
Thank you, thank you.